from scratch. Jonathan, many evangelicals see last night's or the White House dinner the other night as a win for Christians, but there are critics out there. What are some of the criticisms that they're offering against this meeting?
Well, a lot of people have said, and I think it's a fair criticism, that the purpose of this dinner, they called it a state-like dinner, was really, it wasn't to hear evangelicals, it wasn't to hear from the crowd so much as it was to thank the crowd. And then, of course, the New York Times posted some of the leaked audio from it, showing that there was a call basically to get your people out and get them voting. And so it was kind of a traditional whip up the base kind of dinner. And there are a lot of folks who say this is not really good behavior for religious leaders who are trying to represent diverse constituencies that may not be all that comfortable with the president and his policies.
Sure. Well, Jonathan, some have been criticized. I want to particularly focus on J.D. Greear, the new SBC president. He was criticized for attending the dinner because he kind of ran on a platform of detangling the Southern Baptists from partisan politics. But he said being a witness in the public square requires being present in it. So does he have a point?
Well, he does. I don't know that he's making a point that anybody is arguing against. I mean, nobody's saying that the J.D. shouldn't show up in the public square. But you remember, J.D. Greear criticized Mike Pence for showing up at the Southern Baptist Convention and giving a speech saying that we should be focused as Southern Baptists on missions and not on partisan politics. And yet, J.D. shows up voluntarily to the White House to be used, as many would say, as something of a prop for the president to show he has all of this evangelical support. And there he had a speech that was far more partisan than Mike Pence's speech at the Southern Baptist Convention. Of course, it's not the only thing he's done since he's been elected. He went out on a limb to endorse President Trump's Supreme Court nominee. And so it does raise a lot of questions for Southern Baptists to say, okay, if you were going to be partisan, what would you do differently? I don't think you would do anything differently. I think you would have a presidency that looks much like the SBC presidency of J.D. Greear thus far.
So, Jonathan, as an evangelical, what would be the proper response to an invitation to a dinner like we saw the other night?
Well, I think that you have to, what I'm not saying is, and I think what a lot of evangelicals shouldn't be misunderstood as saying, is that you can't go to the White House. I think that the argument that is being made is that we have a very exceptional president, and this is an exceptional moment in American political history. This is a president who holds a lot of views that are deeply divisive, not just among Americans, but among Christians. Even conservative Christians have sort of been fractured over his views on immigration, people who perceive his comments to be sort of coddling white supremacists. You obviously have his personal behavior. And so the argument is not that you shouldn't show up, but that if you're going to show up in these spaces, maybe it's more helpful to take a prophetic stance, to speak up for the least of these, who many would argue are being trampled on by this administration's policies. And I think when it comes to a person like a J.D. Greear or many of the pastors there, I have to wonder today, what about all of the Southern Baptists of color? And there's not a lot of them. But what about all of the brown and black Southern Baptists who feel alienated and marginalized and antagonized by this president? What do they feel today? Do they feel more connected to their denomination? Do they feel like more connected to the mission of Southern Baptists? I think there are a lot of people today that are really struggling with what went on at the White House this last night.
Jonathan, you just mentioned race. We see the political climate of the country right now being pretty divided, and it's not just politics, it's along so many different lines. And we're also seeing some of those divisions seep into the church as well. What do you make of that in the present context of where we are?
Well, it's so hard because when we say it's not political, you know, in American public life, you know, you've got politics, you've got religion, you've got kind of the culture at large, and all these things are kind of tangled together. So I think what we're seeing happening in the church is we're seeing a fracturing along several lines. There are generational shifts that are happening. There are theological shifts that are happening. There are racial shifts. And then you have all these political shifts. And before the political shifts going on in the church were really largely between left and right, conservative and liberal. And so there was this division in the church between liberal Christians and more conservative Christians. But what we're seeing now is even within those subgroups, you're seeing fractures. So you have a person like a Russell Moore, who has deep disagreements with a person like a Pastor Robert Jeffress, and yet they agree on so much theologically. So we are seeing, I think, very much a fractured church that is fracturing along several fault lines, and it is difficult for someone like me who as a, you know, for a living, I'm kind of observing and commenting on these things. It's difficult to imagine what it would look like to bring the church together in unity in a moment like this. I really struggle to see the way forward.
Jesus' words to his disciples, his last words was, "I pray that you may be one," and I can't think of words that would be more appropriate than that.
Yeah, well, for sure. And the question is can we have unity even if we don't have uniformity? And I think that you have a lot of people wondering that. What does it look like to love and to live next to brothers and sisters with whom I have deep, deep disagreements? That will be one of the primary questions that the church and its leaders and its people will have to answer in the 21st century.
Well, Jonathan, we're going to have to leave it there. Jonathan Merritt, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure.